The evening was calm, the sky outside painted with soft shades of orange and gold as the sun began to set. Inside one of the city's most luxurious restaurants, the atmosphere was a mix of quiet elegance and soft chatter. Crystal glasses clinked lightly as waiters glided from table to table, balancing trays of wine and steaming plates of carefully prepared dishes. Gentle music played in the background, just loud enough to create a soothing mood without drowning out conversations. The restaurant was the kind of place where wealthy business people, celebrities, and high society couples came to enjoy their meals. The air was thick with the aroma of expensive wines and roasted delicacies. Every detail of the place, from the velvet chairs to the golden chandeliers, was designed to remind people that they were in a world of luxury. Among the guests that evening was a well-known CEO. He was a man in his late 50s, with neatly combed silver hair and a sharp suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. He walked into the restaurant with the kind of confidence that drew attention, not because people admired him, but because he carried himself as if he owned everything in sight. He had that kind of presence, the kind that made waiters nervous and guests lower their voices when he passed by. He took his seat at a corner table, the spot he often preferred. It gave him the perfect view of the room, allowing him to watch who came in and who went out. His assistant had already booked the table earlier in the day, making sure everything was arranged to his liking. The CEO adjusted his tie, placed his expensive leather briefcase on the chair beside him, and picked up the menu with an air of superiority, as though the restaurant should feel honored to serve him. A few minutes later, another guest walked into the restaurant. He was a black man, tall with a calm and confident demeanor. He wore a perfectly fitted suit, elegant but not flashy. His watch glimmered faintly when the light hit it, yet there was nothing about his appearance that screamed arrogance. Instead, he carried himself with quiet strength, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. He greeted the host politely, gave a warm smile, and was guided to his table not far from the CEO. He sat down with ease, placed his phone neatly on the table, and waited patiently as a waiter brought him some water. There was no rush in his movements, no sense of trying to prove anything. He simply belonged as naturally as anyone else in that room. But the CEO didn't see it that way. From the moment the man walked in, he narrowed his eyes, his expression tightening. He tapped his fingers against the table, watching closely, almost as if he was offended by the man's presence. His mind, clouded with years of arrogance and bias, immediately made assumptions. The CEO leaned back in his chair, smirk tugging at his lips. Loud enough for those nearby to hear, he muttered something under his breath, a remark laced with condescension. The waiter near his table stiffened, clearly uncomfortable, but said nothing. The words weren't shouted, but they were sharp enough to cut through the atmosphere. The black man, however, didn't react. He calmly opened the menu as if he hadn't heard anything at all. He took a sip of his water, his face unbothered, his focus entirely on choosing his meal. It was as though he had mastered the art of rising above unnecessary noise. The CEO, irritated by the man's calmness, leaned forward again. This time he spoke louder, pretending to be casual, but his tone carried the weight of judgment. "Some people don't realize certain places aren't for everyone," he said with a fake laugh, glancing around as if expecting others to agree. A couple at a nearby table exchanged glances, clearly disturbed. One woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat, whispering something to her partner. A waiter froze in the middle of pouring wine, eyes darting nervously between the CEO and the black man. Still, the man at the center of it all remained composed. He didn't lift his eyes. He didn't respond. He simply closed the menu and gave his order to the waiter with a polite smile, as though nothing had been said. His calmness, instead of satisfying the CEO, only made him more restless. The CEO adjusted his suit jacket, his pride bruised by the lack of reaction. To him, silence felt like defiance. He wanted to be acknowledged, to feel superior, to have the final word in a conversation that hadn't even started. So he tried again. This time he leaned toward the black man's table, his voice sharp and clear. "Do you really think you can afford to eat here?" he asked with a smug smile. The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire, bitter and suffocating. The restaurant fell into silence. Forks hovered midair. A spoon clinked against a glass, then stopped. Every eye slowly turned toward the two men. The staff stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or wait. The atmosphere, once warm and comfortable, was now heavy with tension. The black man slowly lifted his gaze. His eyes met the CEO's, calm yet piercing, steady as a mountain. There was no anger in them, no sign of rage, just a quiet strength that made the CEO suddenly shift in his seat. For the first time that evening, the CEO felt slightly uneasy, though he quickly covered it with a smirk. The man gave a small nod, almost like an acknowledgement, and then returned his gaze to the table, as if the CEO's words were nothing more than background noise. That simple act of restraint, that refusal to be dragged into an ugly exchange, spoke louder than any insult could. The silence in the restaurant stretched. People waited, some expecting a heated argument, others hoping for it to end quietly. But the calmness of the black man left everyone curious. Who was he? Why didn't he react? And why did he seem so unshaken by the CEO's arrogance? The CEO, frustrated that his attempt at humiliation had failed, leaned back again. He muttered something under his breath, shaking his head with a look of disbelief. But deep down, beneath all the pride and arrogance, he felt a flicker of discomfort. Something about the man's composure unsettled him. The waiters resumed their work slowly, though their eyes lingered on the scene. Guests whispered quietly at their tables. The air was still tense, as if the room itself was holding its breath, and in the middle of it all, the black man sat calmly, as if the storm around him didn't exist. He sipped his water, adjusted his cufflinks, and waited for his meal, carrying an aura of quiet dignity that no insult could touch. That was the beginning of a night that none of the diners would forget. The restaurant had returned to a fragile calm, though beneath the surface the tension was still there. Guests pretended to focus on their food, but their ears stayed alert, waiting for what might happen next. The waiters moved carefully, trying not to draw attention, but even they couldn't hide the nervous glances they threw toward the corner tables. Everyone had sensed it. Something was brewing. The CEO, leaning back in his chair with a glass of wine in hand, seemed almost proud of himself. He had spoken loudly enough for people to hear, and that gave him a feeling of control. But inside, a different battle was happening. He wanted the man he had mocked to respond, to lose his cool, to create a scene. Yet when that didn't happen, it irritated him more than anything else. The calmness of the man sitting across the room felt like a silent challenge, and the CEO wasn't used to being ignored. He took another sip of his wine, his eyes fixed on the man. His mind whispered ugly things, judgments built on assumptions. He thought he understood everything about the person in front of him just by looking at his skin color, his calm expression, his choice to stay quiet. To the CEO, silence was weakness, and in his world, weakness was something to crush. When the food arrived at the black man's table, it was served with extra care. The waiter placed the dishes gently, bowed slightly, and hurried away, but not before glancing nervously at the CEO's table. The man thanked the waiter softly, unfolded his napkin, and began eating without any sign of discomfort. He carried himself like someone who had been in many such rooms before. He wasn't new to this environment. He belonged here, and that truth was clear in the way he moved, the way he lifted his fork, the way he simply existed without apology. But the CEO couldn't accept that. He set his wine glass down and leaned forward again, his voice louder this time, cutting across the quiet hum of the restaurant. "You know," he said, tilting his head with a mocking smile, "some people think that wearing an expensive suit is enough to make them fit in. But it takes more than that. Money can't buy class." The words stung more for the people listening than for the man they were directed at. A couple at a nearby table looked at each other in disbelief. One guest lowered his fork, shaking his head slightly. A waiter standing near the kitchen door froze for a second, then quickly disappeared inside as if to escape the growing storm. The black man placed his fork gently on the plate. He looked up slowly, his eyes meeting the CEO's once again. This time there was a pause, a silence that stretched long enough for people to hold their breath. But instead of anger, instead of shouting back, he gave the smallest smile. Calm, controlled. Almost as if the CEO's words had no power over him. Then, with the same composure, he returned to his meal. That simple action, the refusal to react, was more powerful than any argument could have been. It made the CEO's attempt at humiliation fall flat, and that only fueled his frustration. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, tapping his fingers against the table as though trying to come up with his next move. He decided to push harder. Raising his voice slightly, he asked, "Tell me, what exactly do you do? I'm curious, because it must be something unusual if it brings you to a place like this." His tone carried a fake sense of interest, but the sarcasm underneath was sharp and obvious. The man didn't respond immediately. He wiped his mouth with his napkin, took a sip of water, and placed the glass back on the table with care. For a moment, the silence returned. The CEO leaned forward, expecting to finally get a reaction. But the man simply smiled again, a smile that carried both patience and quiet strength. He didn't answer. He didn't explain himself. He didn't give the CEO the satisfaction of knowing who he was. The room felt heavier now. Guests looked down at their plates, pretending to be lost in their food, but everyone was listening. Even the soft background music seemed less noticeable. The CEO's words had crossed a line, and people knew it. But no one wanted to be the first to step in. Finally, the CEO leaned back and laughed loudly, a hollow laugh that made a few guests flinch. "I suppose that's the answer," he said mockingly. "Nothing. That's what you do. Nothing. And yet here you are trying to sit among people who built this world, who earned their place. It's funny, really." The cruelty in his tone made the air thick with discomfort. Some diners shifted uneasily in their seats. Others whispered quietly, shaking their heads. The waiters exchanged nervous glances from across the room, unsure if they should alert the manager. And yet the black man remained unmoved. His patience was remarkable, like someone who had long learned the art of not giving power to arrogance. He finished another bite of his meal, his expression steady, almost serene. His calmness was not just silence, it was strength. The CEO, however, mistook it for weakness once again. He leaned closer, his voice dropping slightly but still loud enough to be heard. "I'll tell you something," he said, his tone dripping with superiority. "Success isn't about walking into a fancy place and acting like you belong. Success is about proving yourself, showing the world you're better than the rest, and I can promise you not everyone is cut out for that." The words lingered in the air like a bad smell, souring the atmosphere. A few guests were now openly glaring at the CEO, though he didn't notice. He was too caught up in his own arrogance, too convinced of his own authority. But those watching couldn't take their eyes off the man being targeted. They wondered how long he would stay quiet, how long he would allow himself to be insulted without fighting back. Some admired his restraint while others felt uneasy, wishing he would finally stand up for himself. Little did they know, the silence was not weakness at all. It was strategy. It was patience. It was the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself, because sooner or later, the truth always finds its way into the light. And as the CEO picked up his wine glass once more, smug in his own assumptions, he had no idea that his words, his arrogance, and his judgment were about to crash into a reality he could never have imagined. The restaurant was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint clinking of cutlery from tables far away. People kept their eyes down, but their ears were sharp, listening to every word. The CEO, now leaning back in his chair with a smug grin, thought he had won. He believed his insults had placed him above the man sitting quietly across the room. What he didn't know was that his arrogance had already begun to crumble in the eyes of the other diners. The black man had stayed calm through it all. He had endured the mocking tone, the sneers, the sarcastic questions. To him, this was not the first time he had faced arrogance. Life had taught him patience, and patience had given him strength. He knew that when the right moment came, silence could speak louder than 1,000 words. That moment was now arriving. As the waiter returned with a fresh bottle of wine, the CEO waved him over with a flick of his hand. "Pour it carefully," he demanded, his tone sharp as though speaking to a servant rather than a professional. The waiter obeyed, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes drifted toward the quiet man at the other table. He looked at him with a kind of silent respect, as though he already understood there was more to this story than appearances. When the wine was poured, the CEO lifted his glass in mock celebration. "To success," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the room. He took a slow sip, then set the glass down with a smirk. Of course, not everyone here knows what that word really means. At that moment, the black man finally moved. He placed his fork down gently, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and leaned back in his chair. His expression was calm, but there was a quiet authority in his eyes that made even those sitting nearby sit up straighter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't match the arrogance in tone. Instead, his voice was steady, calm, and clear. "You speak a lot about success," he said, his words carrying effortlessly across the room. "But I wonder if you truly understand it." The CEO blinked, caught off guard by the man's first direct response. For a second, he didn't know what to say. Then he laughed, brushing it off. "Oh, I understand it well enough," he said smugly. "I've built companies, made millions, sat in rooms where real power lives. I don't think I need a lesson from someone who can't even prove he belongs here." The man's eyes never wavered. He leaned forward slightly, his voice still calm. "You say you've built companies. Tell me, do you know the name of the person who owns this restaurant?" The CEO chuckled, waving his hand dismissively. "Of course I do. I've met him before at business gatherings. A very successful investor. He's the kind of man who belongs here." A ripple of curiosity passed through the diners. People leaned in, sensing something important was about to unfold. The waiters stood still, their eyes fixed on the man who had until now remained silent. The man gave a small nod. "That investor you speak of," he said slowly, "is me." The words fell like a stone into a still pond, sending shockwaves through the room. Forks clinked against plates. A woman gasped softly. The waiters exchanged wide-eyed looks, and one nearly dropped a tray he was carrying. The air itself seemed to shift, as though the weight of the truth had rearranged the entire atmosphere. The CEO froze. His smirk vanished, his eyes widening in disbelief. For a moment he looked as though he hadn't heard correctly. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its arrogance. The man repeated himself calmly, his eyes locked on the CEO. "I am the owner of this restaurant. I invested in it, built it from the ground up with the people who stand behind you serving tonight. This place exists because of the work I put into it." The room erupted in murmurs. Diners turned to one another, whispering in shock. Some nodded, as if they had suspected all along that the calm man was not ordinary. Others looked at the CEO with visible disdain. The waiters, who had been standing nervously, now held their heads higher, proud to serve someone they respected deeply. The CEO's face turned pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His arrogance, his pride, his assumptions, all of it had collapsed in an instant. The man he had mocked was not a stranger trying to fit in. He was the very person who had made the restaurant possible. The one who had given life to the very space the CEO thought he controlled with his presence. The black man leaned back again, his expression calm, almost gentle. He didn't gloat. He didn't rub the truth in. He simply allowed the weight of his words to sink in, to settle in the minds of everyone who had heard them. "You see," he said softly, "success is not about loud words or the size of your pocket. Success is about building something that lasts, something that gives opportunities, something that makes people feel welcome. Success is not measured by how much you can look down on someone, but by how many people you can lift up." The restaurant was silent again, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't heavy with tension, it was heavy with respect. Diners looked at the man with admiration. Even those who had remained quiet earlier now felt a sense of pride in simply being present to witness the moment. The CEO shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening around his wine glass. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to salvage what little pride he had left, but his words failed him. No excuse could erase what he had just done. No amount of money, no reputation, no title could change the fact that he had judged a man by his appearance and ended up exposing his own ignorance. For the first time in a long time, the CEO felt small. He had walked into the restaurant believing himself to be the most powerful man in the room. Now he sat there struggling to swallow the bitter taste of humility. The black man, meanwhile, didn't press further. He didn't need to. His truth was enough. The revelation had spoken louder than any argument could. He picked up his glass of water, took a slow sip, and placed it back down. His meal continued as though nothing had happened, but the energy in the room was forever changed. People would remember that night. They would remember the quiet dignity with which he had carried himself, the strength in his silence and the power in his truth, and they would remember how a man blinded by arrogance had been humbled by the very person he tried to belittle. The air in the restaurant felt different now. Only moments earlier, the CEO's voice had been the loudest in the room, dripping with arrogance and superiority. But after the revelation, the weight had shifted. Every eye that once glanced at him out of curiosity was now fixed on him with quiet judgment. The man he had tried to humiliate had turned out to be the very owner of the elegant restaurant he had treated like his personal stage. The CEO's hands trembled slightly as he set his wineglass down. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a forced, uncomfortable smile. He cleared his throat, hoping to break the silence, but his voice sounded weaker than before. "Well," he said with a laugh that didn't quite land. I suppose I should have recognized you. It must have been the lighting." "Yes, the lighting in here. Not the best." His words stumbled out awkwardly, desperate to cover his earlier insults. No one laughed with him. The diners, who had once tried to hide their discomfort, now looked at him with open disdain. Some shook their heads. Others whispered to each other, their voices carrying disapproval. The waiters, once nervous, now moved with renewed confidence, glancing at the black man with respect and at the CEO with thinly veiled disappointment. The man who owned the restaurant remained calm. He didn't gloat, didn't smile in victory, didn't even raise his voice. He simply looked at the CEO with the same calm eyes he had carried all evening. That gaze alone was enough to make the CEO squirm in his seat. He leaned forward, lowering his tone as if to sound humble. "I didn't mean anything by what I said earlier," he muttered quickly. "You know how it is. Long day, too much wine. Poor choice of words." He forced another chuckle, but his voice cracked slightly. The diners weren't buying it. They had heard every word he'd spoken. They had watched his arrogance grow louder, his insults sharper, his tone crueler, and now they were watching him unravel, desperate to erase what everyone had already witnessed. The black man placed his napkin gently on the table, his movements deliberate. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Respect is not a poor choice of words. Respect is either present or it isn't." The CEO froze, his mouth half open, unable to respond. The words hung in the air, cutting through his excuses. He swallowed hard, realizing that his usual tactics, his charm, his money, his forced laughter, would not save him here. He tried again, fumbling for a new approach. "You're right," he said quickly. "Of course you're right. I let my frustration get the better of me. But please understand I have the utmost respect for successful people like you." He emphasized the word successful as though clinging to it like a lifeline. The black man tilted his head slightly, his calm eyes never leaving the CEO. "Respect should not depend on success. Respect should not depend on what someone owns or how much money they carry. It should exist regardless of status." The words landed heavily, not only on the CEO but on everyone listening. Diners nodded quietly, agreeing. One man at a nearby table whispered to his partner, "That's true." "That's exactly right." The CEO's face burned. He tried to laugh again, but the sound came out hollow, strained. He adjusted his tie, tugged at his cuffs, anything to distract himself from the weight of the room pressing in on him. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. His title, his wealth, his influence, none of it mattered here. He had been exposed not just for his arrogance, but for the smallness of his character. I didn't mean to offend," he said again, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier confidence. "Please believe me, it was all a misunderstanding." The black man didn't respond immediately. He took a slow sip of water, his composure steady, his movements graceful. Then he set the glass down and spoke softly, his words measured. "You insulted me without knowing who I was. That alone shows your character. But what if I had been someone without wealth, without a title, without ownership of this place? Would your words have been any different? Or would you have believed they were justified?" The CEO's lips parted, but no words came. His throat tightened as he realized the truth. He hadn't spoken out of ignorance, he had spoken out of arrogance. His words had been fueled by assumptions, by prejudice, by the belief that he could judge someone without consequence. The black man leaned back, his expression calm, almost gentle. "Humility costs nothing," he said softly. "But arrogance can cost you everything." The diners erupted into quiet applause. It wasn't loud or showy, but it carried meaning. It was a sign of respect, not just for the man who had been insulted, but for the wisdom he had shared. The CEO sank lower in his chair, his face red, his pride shattered. He forced another smile, nodding quickly as if trying to agree. "You're absolutely right," he said nervously. I see that now. It was foolish of me. I should have known better." His words tumbled out in a rush, desperate to repair the damage, but the sincerity in them was questionable. The black man didn't argue. He didn't push further. He simply picked up his fork and returned to his meal, his silence more powerful than any lecture could have been. The CEO sat there, shifting uncomfortably, glancing around the room. Everywhere he looked, he saw disapproval. Diners whispered behind their hands. Waiters moved past him without the usual polite smile. He was no longer the center of attention in the way he liked. He was now the example of everything people despised. For the rest of the evening, he hesitated before speaking, his earlier confidence gone. Each word he considered saying died in his throat, replaced by awkward silence. The laughter that once came so easily now refused to come at all. He had been humbled, and no amount of backtracking could erase the memory of what had happened. The black man finished his meal peacefully, unbothered, carrying himself with the same dignity he had shown from the start. His presence filled the room with quiet strength, while the CEO's presence shrank into the background. When the bill arrived, the CEO reached for his wallet, eager to at least show some gesture of goodwill. But the waiter shook his head politely. "It's already taken care of, sir," he said, nodding toward the black man's table. The CEO froze again, his face flushing with both embarrassment and relief. The man he had insulted had not only ignored his arrogance, but had also quietly paid for his meal. It was a gesture that exposed the gap between them, not in wealth but in character. The CEO lowered his head, speechless. For the first time in a long time, he felt the sting of humility. And as he sat there in silence, the lesson began to take root in a place deeper than pride could ever reach. The evening in the restaurant was moving toward its natural close. Plates had been cleared from many tables. Soft music continued to hum in the background, and yet the room still felt heavy with what had taken place. The CEO sat quietly, no longer the loudest voice in the room, no longer the man who commanded attention with arrogance. Instead, he looked smaller, his back slouched slightly, his eyes cast down toward the glass of wine that had long since lost its taste. The other diners were still whispering among themselves, not loudly, but just enough to show that the memory of his words hadn't faded. Every glance that fell on him reminded him of what he had done, of how quickly pride can turn into humiliation. He tugged at his cufflinks, straightened his tie, and tried to compose himself, but nothing could erase the image people now carried of him. The black man, meanwhile, sat in calm silence, finishing the last bites of his meal with dignity. His composure had never wavered. From the moment he had walked in until now, he had remained steady, patient, and confident. He didn't need to raise his voice or lash out. His strength had spoken through his calmness. His dignity had carried more weight than the CEO's insults, and his truth had silenced the arrogance that once filled the air. When his meal was done, he signaled politely for the waiter. The staff, who had been watching with quiet admiration all night, moved quickly to attend to him. The manager himself came forward, bowing his head slightly, not out of obligation but out of genuine respect. The man smiled, thanked them softly, and stood up. The CEO, realizing he might lose his only chance to salvage something, quickly stood up too. He almost stumbled as he pushed his chair back, his movements clumsy in his rush. He approached the man, his voice softer now, trembling with nervousness. I owe you an apology," he said, his eyes darting to the ground, then back up. "What I said earlier, it was wrong. I spoke without thinking. I didn't mean to offend you." The restaurant grew quiet again, everyone waiting to hear the response. The black man looked at him calmly, his expression neither harsh nor forgiving just yet. He studied the CEO for a moment as though weighing his words. Then, in the same steady tone he had used all evening, he replied, "You didn't speak without thinking. You spoke exactly what was in your heart at that moment. Words reveal what we carry inside. You thought your success made you greater than others, so you felt free to insult a stranger." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But now you've learned something. Success doesn't excuse arrogance. Respect is not optional. It's the foundation of every relationship, every business, every life." The CEO's face flushed again. He nodded quickly, almost desperately. Yes, you're right. I understand now. I'll remember this." The man gave him a small, almost gentle smile. "I hope you do, because one day you may sit across from someone who has less than you. No wealth, no title, no influence. If you cannot respect them as much as you would respect me now, Then you haven't truly learned the lesson. Those words carried through the room like a soft echo. Diners nodded, some even clapped lightly, their admiration clear. The CEO bowed his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. For the first time in years, he was not the man people looked up to, but the man people pitied. The black man extended his hand. The gesture was not to erase what had happened, but to remind the CEO that growth was possible. Hesitantly, with sweaty palms, the CEO shook his hand. It was a handshake that felt more like mercy than anything else. Then the man turned, thanked the staff once more, and walked calmly toward the exit. His presence filled the room even as he left, leaving behind an atmosphere of respect, dignity, and reflection. The CEO stood there for a moment, watching him go. His chest tightened with a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, shame mixed with realization. He slowly returned to his seat, but the room no longer belonged to him. The diners didn't look at him with admiration anymore. They looked at him as a reminder of how quickly pride can bring a man down. He stayed quiet for the rest of the evening, finishing his wine in small, hesitant sips. Eventually, he asked for his coat and left quietly, slipping out into the cool night air with no farewell, no applause, no respect following him. The city lights flickered around him, but none of them seemed to shine on him that night. Back inside the restaurant, the conversations picked up again. People shared their thoughts in low voices. "Did you see how calm he was?" one woman said to her friend. "He didn't even raise his voice once, and still he silenced that man completely." Another diner added, "It's rare to see someone so composed. Most people would have exploded after hearing such words, but he handled it with grace." That's true strength. The staff, too, spoke quietly among themselves as they cleaned the tables. For them, it wasn't just about serving food, it was about working in a place built by someone who carried himself with honor. They felt proud, inspired, and grateful to be part of something greater than just a restaurant. As the night ended and the last guests began to leave, one thought lingered in the air. Respect is the true measure of greatness. Wealth may buy luxury, titles may open doors, but without respect, all of it crumbles into nothing. For the CEO, the night became a turning point. Though he would never admit it out loud, the lesson stayed with him. He replayed the words over and over in his mind. Respect should not depend on success. Humility costs nothing, but arrogance can cost you everything. It haunted him at first, then slowly began to change him. For the first time, he started to question his own actions, his own words, his own way of treating people. The humiliation of that evening turned into reflection, and reflection slowly turned into change. For the black man, the night was nothing more than another evening in a long journey. He hadn't needed to prove himself, hadn't needed to show his wealth or power. His dignity, his composure, and his quiet strength had done all the speaking. To him, the greatest victory was not in humbling the CEO, but in showing everyone present that respect is not about who you are in the world, but about how you treat those around you. The lesson of that night spread quietly. Diners told the story to their friends. The staff repeated it to their families. And the memory lived on, not as a tale of conflict, but as a reminder of the power of humility, patience, and dignity. Because in the end, the CEO was right about one thing: success does matter. But he had been wrong about what success truly is. Success is not measured by arrogance or the ability to belittle others. Success is measured by the lives you touch, the respect you give, and the humility you carry, no matter how high you rise. That night, in that quiet luxury restaurant, everyone learned that lesson. Some learned it with admiration. One man learned it with shame, but no one left unchanged.